It's my happy task to welcome you to the annual poetry reading honoring the life and work of former University of Chicago student Pearl Andelson Sherry. Pearl Sherry was born on the west side of Chicago in 1899, and despite objections from her father, she attended the University of Chicago for 1 year, probably in 1916 to 17. And at the university, Pearl Sherry joined a group of young writers and poets who included Ivor Winters and Janet Lewis, and she remained friends with them for the rest of her life. And she began her own writing career working at Poetry magazine with Harriet Monroe. Her first book of poetry, which was Fringe, was published in 1923, and over the span of her 97 years, her poetry, fiction, and reviews appeared in prestigious periodicals like The Dial, The New Republic, The Southern Review. And in 1997, the Sherry family made a gift to the university to support an annual reading by a distinguished visiting poet. And we've been fortunate enough to number persons like Elaine Rawlings, Campbell McGrath, Mark Doty, Alan Grossman, Jim Powell, Michael Palmer, amongst our Sherry poets, and of course there are lots more, and I apologize to all the ones I've missed. I now want to introduce my colleague Janice Knight, Associate Professor in the Department of English in the College and Acting Chair of Creative Writing, to introduce the 2007 Sherry poet, Susan Howe.
Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome Susan Howe back to the University of Chicago. I want to begin by just giving you some of the extraordinary facts about Susan's career. She's recently retired from the SUNY Buffalo, the English department, where she was the Samuel P. Capen Chair in Poetry and the Humanities. And she's also been a distinguished visiting faculty member at such universities as Princeton, Stanford, and now University of Chicago. Howe is the author of some 18 volumes of poetry, among them Articulation of Sound Forms in Time, Singularities, The Midnight, and most recently, The Souls of the Labadie Tract. Her work has been recognized by a host of prizes and awards, including this year the Teasdale Prize for Poetry from Wellesley College for Distinguished Lifetime Contribution. Howe is widely regarded as one of the most important poets writing today and has been described by critics both as rigorously skeptical and experimentalist, and also a profoundly mystical poet together. So I think that's a very interesting combination. Her work has been widely anthologized and translated, and it's the subject of numerous scholarly articles. Also, I want to say that tomorrow afternoon, if we haven't announced that, there'll be a conversation with Marjorie Perloff, who will be discussing Susan's work, and that's go to the website for creative writing or poetry and poetics, and you'll find the location for that. And also next Thursday, in collaboration with musician David Grubbs, Susan will be performing sections of her recent work, The Souls of the Labadie Tract. And no doubt most of you know Howe primarily as a poet, but as a scholar of early American literature and culture, I want to actually say a word today about my Susan Howe, that is, about her work as a scholar and a critic of American literature, particularly early American literature and culture. Here are the relevant texts are her 1985 work, My Emily Dickinson, and in 1993, the birthmark, Unsettling the Wilderness in American Literary History. Like her own beloved Perry Miller, Howe's critical work, I believe, has awakened a new generation of young poets and scholars to the interest and value of such writers as Jonathan Edwards, Anne Hutchinson, and Mary Rawlinson. Her scholarly work discovers and vivifies an early American archive that is often obscure, sometimes forbidding, and always partial and partisan. In the American grain of Ralph Waldo Emerson, William Carlos Williams, and Charles Olson, Howe's work confirms the visionary power of the poet as historian. And like them, she insists on the singular importance of a distinctly American tradition. Of the poetry of Wallace Stevens, she has written, quote, They wouldn't have, of the poems of Wallace Stevens she's written, they wouldn't have such incarnational power if they didn't have deep roots in a redemptive New England tradition stretching from Edwards through Emerson. Speaking of herself, she states the matter more succinctly. New England is the place I am. Howe declares in the Souls of Labadie tract that her mission is as follows. I wish to speak a word for libraries as places of freedom and wildness. Hunting for sustenance and inspiration in the records, traces, and silences of the American archive, Howe herself becomes a library cormorant, most alive when she is, quote, and this is Howe speaking, surrounded by raw material paper afterlife. She confesses, quote, well, I like to think I write for the dead. I also take my life as a poet from their lips, their vocalisms. As historian, we might see hers first as a project of recovery. She posits, quote, if history is the record of survivors, then poetry shelters other voices. These other voices, the excluded, outlawed, erased, or silent ones, constitute for Howe a tradition of antinomianism and a covenant of grace that shelters her own life and work. This is Howe again, quoting. Voices I am following lead me to the margins, she observes, and most often these voices are the voices of women, Barbary Cutter, Anne Hutchinson, and Emily Dickinson, and also the voice of feminized men, for whom Howe revives a modern audience, Thomas Shepard, Jonathan Edwards, perhaps John Cotton. And often, as readers, we receive these voices only in fragments, in the marks and blanks of the page. And it's Howe who alerts us to the importance of those stray marks and blanks. Her interest in the fragment also extends to the material traces left behind her New England ancestors, to bits of lace, to the bed hangings treasured by Puritan women, and the material shape of the scraps of paper that Emily Dickinson jotted upon, and the small square of silk from Sarah Edwards' wedding gown. These material shapes also inspire Howe to a kind of writing in fragments that in turn gestures to the plenitude of the blank page itself. Some might say that in her most experimental poems and historical works, Howe reveals herself as most antinomian. Her description of Emily Dickinson, quote, she explored the implications of breaking the law just short of breaking off communication with the reader, end quote, might be an apt self-portrait. But even as she attends to the failures of communication that characterize our archive, Howe is also profoundly New England in her commitment to the incarnational power of the word as spirit. In my class yesterday, she guided the students to these words from Jonathan Edwards' personal narrative, quote, sometimes only mentioning a single word causes my heart to burn within me. Howe might have written this sentence herself. As her readers know, Howe often pitches her poetic and critical energies on the transformative power of the word. Sometimes discovered whispering from within the smallest and most mysterious archival fragment, a single word captures her attention and is then followed out through Noah Webster's taxonomizing and traced through our literary history, quote, opening hidden and repressed memories and gesturing to a potential fullness that might indeed be, to use an Edwardian term, inexpressible. In reading Howe as historian, I am always recalled to these lines by Wallace Stevens. Children picking up our bones will never know that these were once as quick as foxes on the hill. Like a latter-day Ezekiel, Howe breathes upon these dry bones, upon the words, the fragments, and memories of our American past, to quicken them and to discover to us new meanings and possibilities within our own historical moment. Howe's reading lecture today is entitled Choir Answers to Choir, Notes on Jonathan Edwards and Wallace Stevens. Please help me to welcome Susan Howe.
Well, I never had a more beautiful introduction than that. I don't know how to follow it. Thank you. And I remember Janice and I going over the Shepherd manuscripts at the Houghton. She was one of the only scholars in American literature that doesn't think I'm mad or pays some attention to my work. So it meant a tremendous amount to me that she worked with me when I was just working on the essays in the birthmark. Anyway, I started this. Can you hear me, by the way? Because I noticed the mic has a funny echo. Is that all right?
It's got a funny echo.
Huh? It does. It has a funny echo. It's weird.
Can we turn it down?
What if I don't use the mic? Is that
I think that filming it away, it sounds better.
if I step away? Yeah. It's, no, I noticed the echo. Anyway,
Can it be turned down?
I
Julia's going to see if it can be turned down a little bit.
now is that better? No. I can't. Is it better? Okay. Anyway, all right. I started this as a paper, this thing that I'm going to read, on Jonathan Edwards last year at the MLA, but it has since widened into being a work in progress in terms of something that I'd like to write about what Stevens means to me that I have never been able to write and keeps changing and developing, and also was helped by my work writing the Souls of the Labadee Tract. And the first title I had was Quotation and Originality after Emerson's essay, but perhaps because I was working with David Grubbs on this CD, I got involved again with thinking about the work of Charles Ives and his use of quotation in his music, and also the essays before a sonata, which are many reasons terribly interesting to me, and that's why I called it Choir Answers to Choir. But then, while I was working on the thing, I was working away on my computer and the power went off, and boom, I lost, the way you lose stuff. And it came back, and whatever it said something like, or I said, anyway, I then had it labeled Chicago Saved. And then it went again away, and it came back, Chicago Saved, Saved. And I think maybe that's going to be my title for this whole piece. It's a chance title, but it seems sort of beautiful. So anyway, this is now Chicago Saved, Saved. Still, okay.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
So Susan, there's a bottle of water.
Okay. I probably won't.
Hello, 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 hello. Is it buzzy still?
Now,
Not so
if
much?
I speak, wait a minute, is that okay? Is that less buzzy? Less buzzy. Oh, good. Okay. Also, I am. There's a lot of quotation in this, which is why it was originally called Quotation and Originality. But I also I make clear that in long passages, but I run through Stevens' lines that are embedded in the way that Charles Ives embeds in his music. Okay. Jonathan Edwards' personal narrative was probably composed retrospectively in 1740 as a letter to his future son-in-law, Aaron Burr. Always blown my mind that Aaron Burr was his the evil Aaron Burr was his grandson. So, anyway, Burr had asked him to describe his spiritual journey toward conversion. Here he recalls the period during 1723, he was 19, when serving as an unordained supply pastor to a small Presbyterian church at Wall Street and Broadway in Manhattan, then a city with 7,000 to 10,000 inhabitants, quote, I very frequently used to retire into a solitary place on the bank of Hudson's River at some distance from the city, for the contemplation of divine things and secret converse with God, and had many sweet hours there. I had then, and at other times, the greatest delight in the Holy Scriptures of any book whatsoever. Oftentimes in reading it, every word seemed to touch my heart. I felt a harmony between something in my heart and those sweet and powerful words. I seemed to see so much light exhibited by every sentence and such a refreshing food communicated that I could not get along in reading, often dwelling on one sentence to see the wonders contained in it, and yet almost every sentence seemed to be full of wonders." Unquote. Reading personal narrative, I experience a vision of being alone in a zone of time without the ticking of clocks. Verbal artistry can be a force for mercy. On August 10, 1903, 23-year-old Wallace Stevens, then clerking in the New York law office of W.G. Peckham, wrote the following entry in his journal, quote, "Went by ferry and trolley to Hackensack over in Jersey. From H, I walked 5.5 miles on the Spring Valley Road, then 5 miles to Ridgewood, then another mile to Hokukus, and back 7 miles more to Patterson. 17.5 in all, a good day's jaunt at this time of year. I love to walk along with a slight wind playing in the trees about me and think over 1,001 odds and ends. Last night, I spent an hour in the dark transept of St. Patrick's Cathedral, where I go now and then in my lonely moods. An old argument with me is that the true religious force in the world is not the church, but the world itself, the mysterious callings of nature and our responses. But today in my walk, I thought that after all there is no conflict of forces, but rather a contrast. In the cathedral, I felt one presence. On the highway, I felt another. The priest in me worshipped one God in one shrine, the poet another God at another shrine. The priest worshipped mercy and love, the poet beauty and might. In the shadows of the church, I could hear the prayers of men and women. In the shadows of the trees, nothing human mingled with divinity. As I sat dreaming with the congregation, I felt how the glittering altar worked on my senses, stimulating and consoling them. And as I went tramping through the fields and woods, I beheld every leaf and blade revealing, or rather betokening, the invisible." Unquote. Beauty, harmony, and order are represented by the arrangement and repetition of particular words on paper. Often, while reading Jonathan Edwards' personal narrative, or the poems gathered together in Wallace Stevens' last two collections, Auroras of Autumn and The Rock, I feel the inexpressible sense of affection Edwards describes when referring to his reading as an ecstatic union between nature and scripture. It's hard not to simply say, "Here, look at this," or "Listen to this line," which is partly what I'm doing, because no matter how many theoretical and critical interpretations there are, in the end, each new clarity of discipline and delight comes down to inexpressible intricacies and ecstasies of form. Emerson's The Instant Dependence of Form Upon Soul. As an American poet writing in the early 21st century, I owe these authors an incalculable debt for ways in which, through word frequencies and zero frequencies, their writing locates, rescues, and delivers what is secret, wild, double, and various in the near at hand. As Emily Dickinson puts it, the zeros teach us phosphorus. We learn to like the fire. Beauty's simultaneity with the fire of living poetry is largely outside contemporary critical interest. The professional discipline of literary scholarship tends to dismiss Jonathan Edwards' religious intensity as embarrassingly outmoded. Mention his name, and the title of one sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," is sure to follow, and that is usually that. In 2007, we see through speculative knowledge, so we're loath to embrace the imaginative and aesthetic crossing he makes between our material world, the world of types, and the spiritual world as it actively flows from revelation into human history. For Edwards, new truths are suggested through inspiration, but such light is only understood and revealed in the Word of God. It can't be given without the Word. This Calvinist minister, who spent his life in the 18th century Connecticut River Valley and didn't write in verse, had the imagination of a poet. He believed that precise word choices, when disciplined into becoming bare embodiments of ideas, would become the source or occasion of conceptual discovery. The gospel is a glass by which this light is conveyed to us, 1 Corinthians 13:12. Now we see through a glass, but a few words, and yet, and yet. The word is gone out of me and will not return. And you know, or rather you can't know. Active in all, passive in none, but passive in all by self-moving power, a poem must banish its author. Opposed entries face each other in mutual requirement. During the 1740s, it is as true to write, quote, "There is yet more of an image of the Trinity in the soul of man. There is mind and its understanding or idea, and the will or affection or love, answering to God, the idea of God, and the love of God. Indeed, the whole outward creation, which is but the shadows of his being, is made as to represent spiritual things," unquote. As it is circa 1940 to write, quote, "Proposita, 1. God and the imagination are one. 2. The thing imagined is the imaginer. The second equals the thing imagined and the imaginer are one. Hence, I suppose, the imaginer is God," unquote. For Edwards, the scheme of providence is like a tree above ground, gradually displayed as the branches successively put forth themselves. For Stevens, all of our ideas come from the natural world, trees equal umbrellas. Time's dissociative force can't tear these two analogies apart. Spontaneous harmony retains the New England landscape from which they spring. This is Edwards' personal narrative. "I used to spend my time, as it always seemed natural to me, to sing or chant forth my meditations, to speak my thoughts in soliloquies, and speak with a singing voice," unquote. Pure poetry, beauty of the prize of battle. A dream I had is slipping away, drawing what is fleetingly nocturnal inside itself. Freedom is at an end, has perfectly ceased to be, at the first moment of freedom. The folio-size double leaves Jonathan Edwards wrote on were often homemade, hand-stitched from linen rags salvaged by women from worn-out clothing. Grassroots, out-of-tune steps and branches, quotations of psalms, dissonant scripture clusters are pressed between coarse cardboard covers with frayed edges. Harmony continues to exist through fact and experience, though there is no reason why it should, nor is there any proof you can read back to the notion of one mind's inner relation with nature's vibratory hum. Lyric poets can't move heaven and earth in order to say things language separates from music, through yearning muted rhythmic pulse, through stepwise voice motion. In an essay titled "The Present State of Poetry, American Poetry at Mid-Century," Delmore Schwartz recalled, "I first heard Wallace Stevens read his poetry at Harvard. It was the first time he had ever read his poetry in public, and this first reading was at once an indescribable ordeal and a precious event to him. Before and after reading each poem, he spoke of the nature of poetry, and he said, among other things, that the least sound counts, the least sound and the least syllable. He illustrated this observation by telling of how he had awakened after midnight the week before and heard the sound of a cat walking delicately and carefully across the crusted snow outside his house. During the 1940s, Miss Valiant, the principal of Buckingham, then a girls' school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, read us passages from the King James Version of the Bible at Monday morning assemblies in the gym. The platform she stood on was made from pushing together wooden boxes normally used in gymnastic classes. Some fathers, uncles, and brothers were away overseas or just returned from the war. Can there be an original rhythmic nature of intuition? Marion Valiant, our leader and captain, wore her reddish hair pulled back into a bun, monody, with wisps straggling out at the edges, polyphony. Our school hymn was Jerusalem. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, we sang, without needing to know the words were taken from the preface to Milton, a poem in 2 books, by the author and printer William Blake, 1804, to justify the ways of God to men, that its theme was the descent of John Milton into William Blake's body, his left foot, or that England's green and pleasant land served as a type for the Garden of Eden. Split from pressing social and political concerns, the fissures and rifts that surround and control us, children coming into their aesthetic inheritance can't foresee how accidentally scattered experiences become synthesized in memory. Apocalypses and last judgments take hold as shadows or distant associations of sound and sense. Sun on the playground outside, discipline in Genesis. Prayer was natural to Miss Valiant. Her sensory allegiance to old loves and old knowledge carried life from prose directly into poetry, as if there was no rhythmic borderline. A curriculum, a vigor, a local abstraction, call it once more a river, an unnamed flowing. The river is poetry, or is it simply infinite night? Call it again and again. She has slipped out invisibly into the night on secret errands of her love. Sometimes while reading Stevens, I feel as if a soul has power to imagine non-existent things and can pass from one body into another. Listen to the dramatic way in which the 3 opening tercets of The Owl in the Sarcophagus successively put themselves forward like the branches of a tree. 2 forms move among the dead. High sleep, who by his highness quiets them. High peace, upon whose shoulders even the heavens rest. 2 brothers. And a 3rd form, she that says goodbye in the darkness, speaking quietly there to those who cannot say goodbye themselves. These forms are visible to the eye that needs out of the whole necessity of sight. The 3rd form speaks because the ear repeats, and then at the beginning of the 4th tercet, without a voice, inventions of farewell. In the Sounds chapter of Walden, Thoreau rejoices that there are owls because their hooting suggests, quote, a vast and undeveloped nature which men have not recognized. Owls recognize the stark twilight and unsatisfied thoughts which all have. All day the sun has shone on the surface of some savage swamp where the single spruce stands and small hawks circulate above, and the chickadee lisps in the evergreens, and the partridge and rabbit skulk beneath. But now a more dismal and fitting day dawns, and a different race of creatures awakens to express the meaning of nature there, unquote. Research tells me Stevens wrote The Owl in the Sarcophagus while he was in an elegiac frame of mind after the death of his closest friend Henry Church. Church, heir to the Arm & Hammer baking soda fortune and a wealthy expatriate patron of the arts, was a poet and publisher of the influential French quarterly Mesures. The Churches returned to America during the war years. He contributed to Princeton's creative arts program and provided money for the symposium held there in 1941, where Stevens read his essay, The Noble Rider and the Sound of Words. After the war, the Churches returned to live in France, where he died suddenly on April 4th, Good Friday, 1947. Harold Bloom calls The Owl the least accessible of Stevens' major poems. Joseph Riddell and others see it as an expression of the loss of faith, the mythology of modern death purged of transcendence. Understanding isn't something that belongs to reason. Understanding comes to pass as an outward sign of inward grace. The feeling of union and bliss I get while reading The Owl in the Sarcophagus is intuitive. Delight springs from the sense of fluid sound patterns phonetic utterance excites in us. Poetry of Owl's magnitude comes into being as a running parallel to religious faith, a light unto the world that a reader may experience as distinguishing glory. In The Noble Rider and the Sound of Words, Stevens says, the deepening need for words to express our thought and feelings, which we are sure are all the truth we shall ever experience, having no illusions, makes us listen to words when we hear them, loving them and feeling them, makes us search the sound of them for a finality, a perfection, an unalterable vibration which is only within the power of the acutest poet to give. What Louis Zukofsky admired most in Stevens' writing was the words, not the style, the manner, not the matter. Zukofsky said he read harmonium constantly. Marianne Moore speaks of his adjectives as having the force of verbs. For me, immense perspectives of the eye occur in phonically unexpected word order. This is form gulping after formlessness. Often a line is a poem in itself, and my very favorite in the Sarcophagus is, "O exhalation, O fling without a sleeve." Poetry has no proof, nor plan, nor evidence by decree or in any other way. From somewhere in the twilight realm of sound, a spirit of belief flares up at the point where meaning stops and the unreality of what seems most real floods over us. It's a sense of self-identification and trust, or the granting of grace in an ordinary room in a secular time. In a sermon titled A Divine and Supernatural Light, immediately imparted to the soul by the Spirit of God, shown to be both a scriptural and a rational doctrine, 1734, Jonathan Edwards says that no merely notational or speculative understanding of the doctrines of religion will ever draw forth that sincere love to God, which is the only principle of a true, gracious, and universal obedience, to accord and to sympathize. I imagine him day after day, thinking with pen in hand, no paper air, no blank piece, every surface covered, nothing wasted. Keeping in the center of his thinking the principle that an undefinable simple idea can be expressed only by experience of preparatory work in which words engender objects, in spite of the fact there is no inherent reason a particular word should stand so wrought, refined by fire, into nature. The sun itself, not circumscribed by a proper name, in the light-bound space of the mind, the flaureate flare, you and your work. This is Edwards. I went mourning without the sun. I stood up and I cried in the congregation, I am a brother to dragons and a companion to owls. Connection to words that went before, running in veins, various titles, notations, numbered entries, stains of little pen ink trials. And then I include sort of diary portions in this thing I'm working in. April 11, 2006, Princeton, New Jersey. Edwards arrived here in 1758 from Stockbridge, Massachusetts, a frontier village, stockade, and Indian mission, to become the third president of what was then called the College of New Jersey. He died almost immediately from the complications of a smallpox vaccination. The cemetery where he's buried is 3 blocks away from the table I am sitting at now. Sunlight has just escaped around the edge of the perpetually drawn curtains in the Firestone Library's Rare Books and Special Collections reading room. It lights up the tables and warms the silent researchers. He was born October 5th, 1703, on his minister father's farm in Windsor, Connecticut. Like Emily Dickinson and Wallace Stevens, he never saw Europe. Like them, he was a voracious book borrower and acquirer. He persuaded his Northampton parish to give him an allowance for books, and he tracked down ones he wanted, rare editions, such as the Yer Osorius, Cologne, 1584, and a Hebrew lexicon bound in otter skin, now in this library. When he died, he left 336 volumes and 536 pamphlets. That's a lot of volumes for someone who spent his last 8 years in a mission outpost. Often his manuscripts are written on the margins of abandoned pamphlets, covers of letters, even remnants of silk paper used by Sarah, his wife, and their 10 daughters, Esther, Elizabeth, Anne, Mary, Eunice, Abigail, Jerusha, Hannah, Lucy, and Martha, for making fans. He constructed most of the 9 books of the journal titled Miscellanies by himself. Only the 9th was made by a bookbinder. Book 1, 1722, is a folio made from gathering separately folded sheets stitched together with the pages ruled in double columns. Other covers are made of heavy paper, except Book 2, which is decorated oilcloth. On rare occasions, when they do appear, periods and commas are generally indistinguishable. The prose retains its regularity and harmony, even vertically, in gutter margins. Now, melodic fragments balance at an indifferent point, approaching nothingness. And this is another day, October 24th, 2007, Guilford, Connecticut. This is Edwards. God's absolute sovereignty and justice with respect to salvation and damnation is what my mind seems to rest assured of as much as of anything that I see with my eyes, unquote. I know such arch conservative Christian rhetoric is problematical in the bleak light of our current fundamentalist political landscape. But in 2007, with personal narrative open beside me, and late October afternoon light beginning to draw back into itself, as a North American, I identify with Edwards' ardency of soul when looking into his heart he, quote, views his wickedness and feels sunk down in his sins below hell itself, far beyond the eye of sovereign grace that can pierce down even to such a depth, unquote. This is no narrative monument of empty phrases. Increasingly, after I read the New York Times in the morning, I go about with these same expressions, this is him again, in my mind and in my mouth, infinite upon infinite, infinite upon infinite. The famous sermon delivered in 1741 at Enfield, Massachusetts, with its title's impact and its petrifying epigraph from Deuteronomy 32:35, their foot shall slide in due time, seems contemporary. It expresses the depth of America's sin in Iraq and elsewhere, and this kind of theological language covers it somehow. It seems to be able to bear that the heaviness of this of Cheney and Bush. The bow of God's wrath is bent and the arrow made ready on the string. Okay. Time and again, without a word wasted, Marianne Moore captures what is specific to the compact spontaneity, the mastery of pause and tone in Wallace Stevens' poems, while never forgetting their wit and play. For Predilections, 1954, she ended her review of his first three collections, first published in Poetry in 1937, with the following condensed and strengthened conclusion, quote, "As R.P. Blackmer has said, the poems rise like a tide. They embody hope that in being frustrated becomes fortitude, and they prove to us that the testament to emotion is not volubility. Refusal to speak results here in an eloquence by which we are convinced that America has in Wallace Stevens at least one artist whom professionalism will never demolish," unquote. What does she mean by professionalism? Is she crying out against the moral and spiritual weakness of 20th century American cultural practice, or is this a more general admonishment against a characteristic failing of human perception? Demolish, to throw or pull down, reduce to ruins, lay waste, put an end to. Did she choose this ferocious verb because another world war was imminent? Is demolish meant to register accurately on our senses, the way sense impressions come to a human spirit, bearing love and sometimes terror? Poetry is a destructive force is a Stevens poem she particularly admired. Poets write for their predecessors. Jonathan Edwards sets a local example of uncompromising dedication to work that isn't greed. Like Stevens, his interpretive consciousness is moral in terms of historical sense and the needs and conscience of readers. Listen to this long and flowing first sentence of Edwards' 77th entry in the folio volume he titled Images of Divine Things. There is a wonderful analogy between what is seen in rivers. They are gathering from innumerable small branches, beginning at a great distance, one from another, in different regions, some on the sides or tops of mountains, others in valleys, and all conspiring to one common issue, all after those very diverse and contrary courses which they held for a while, yet all gathering more and more together the nearer they come to their common end and ultimate issue, and all at length discharging themselves at one mouth into the same ocean. I need not run the parallel, he later explains, between this and the course of God's providence through all ages, from the beginning to the end of the world, when all things shall have their final issue in God. The divinatory repetition of types and antitypes found throughout the work of this Puritan parson who writes as an artist resurfaces in the next to last poem of Stevens' collected poems published in 1954, the year before his death. Here, his use of scriptural similes and metaphors is reminiscent of his predecessor's mixing of typological signification and natural phenomena. Perry Miller's edition of Images or Shadows of Divine Things had been published in 1948, followed by Jonathan Edwards a year earlier, and I'm just sure Stevens had read it, seen it certainly, and read it. I'm making that assumption. Anyway, this is the poem, The River of Rivers in Connecticut. There is a great river this side of Stygia, before one comes to the first black cataracts and trees that lack the intelligence of trees. In that river, far this side of Stygia, the mere flowing of the water is a gaiety, flashing and flashing in the sun. On its banks, no shadow walks. The river is fateful, like the last one, but there is no ferryman. he could not bend against its propelling force. It is not to be seen beneath the appearances that tell of it. The steeple at Farmington stands glistening, and Haddam shines and sways. It is the third commonness with light and air, a curriculum of vigor, a local abstraction. Call it once more a river, an unnamed flowing, space-filled, reflecting the seasons, the folklore of each of the senses. Call it again and again, the river that flows nowhere, like a sea. Even if the haunted shock effect of the first line's last word, Stygia, summons mythical associations with European elegiac and pastoral tradition, the river of time that casts souls on its bank, but carries away everything else without effort. This unnamed river of rivers, far this side of the pagan death river Styx, is the psalmist river of eternal life. There is a river, the streams whereof shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacles of the Most High. This unnamed river is a trope for Hartford's local path to the sea, originally called Quanhecticut or Quenticut, for long tidal river. This unnamed river of rivers may also serve as a trope for Thoreau's Concord River, once called Muscataquid or Meadow, river of peace and quietness, river of battlefield ghosts. On its banks, local Connecticut place names, Haddam and Farmington, gathered into steeples on their village commons, glisten and sway. This great original river before is where poetry flows into prayer. Thank you.